The Russia factor. How will relations between the United States and Russia fare in an all-important election year? Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. The United States and Russia have a long history of confrontation and engagement. Ties between the two nuclear powers have been strained in recent years, from accusations of interfering in the 2016 U.S. elections to Russia's role in Syria and the Ukraine conflict. Navigating relations with Russia remains the United States' biggest foreign policy challenge. The latest flashpoint in U.S. Russia ties: allegations Russia paid bounties to Taliban militants to kill U.S. troops, a claim the Kremlin denies. U.S. officials now saying the intelligence of Russia is less than conclusive. Lots to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Viktor Olevich is a lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics, a Moscow-based think tank. He joins us from Russia's capital. Also in Moscow, Anton Fedyashin is a history professor and director of the Carmel Institute at American University in Washington, D.C. With us here in D.C., Tony Shaffer is president of the London Center for Policy Research, and also joining us here in Washington via Skype, Yuval Weber is chair of Russian military and political strategy at the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Anton, let me start with you. Relations between Russia and the United States, and as I pointed out, these are two nuclear powers, are extremely poor right now, and that's putting it mildly. The United States has imposed sanctions on Russia over its involvement in Ukraine and Georgia, among other countries. There are also tensions over Russia's role in Syria, and there are these accusations, perennial accusations, that Moscow interfered in U.S. elections. What is your assessment of the relationship right now?
Well, it's, the assessment, I think, would be common to pretty much everyone, which is that it is pretty bad. The real disagreements begin when you try to figure out exactly who's responsible for what and what accusations can actually stick or not. From the Russian perspective, and this is what I hear in Moscow on a regular basis, the complaint is that Russia has become a sort of punching bag, a hostage of domestic American politics. And so if someone wants to swing anything at an opponent, it would be Russia that is swung. And as a result, the international relations between the two countries are suffering. This is nothing new. The feeling in Moscow seems to be strategic patience, simply waiting this out because the Russians feel like they've tried everything and nothing has worked. So they have now sort of retreated from active attempts to deal with the Americans in a constructive way, and they're just going to wait out to see what happens. And it's not just waiting out Donald Trump, it's waiting out an unspecified period of time and waiting for the United States to really begin to engage with Russia in a constructive fashion.
Yuval Weber, what is your view on the state of relations right now? Do you believe that better relations with Russia have been sacrificed because of domestic politics in the United States?
Well, I think it's from both sides. I think from the 2016 electoral interference that you mentioned earlier, the whole genesis of that was that the Russians were afraid that a President Hillary Clinton would be very anti-Russia. And so the motivation to help Donald Trump at that time was to get a person who, first of all, would be friendlier than Hillary Clinton, but second of all, would actually see the world in the same sort of transactional terms that President Putin does, and that he'd be a person that Russia could do business with. That also has not turned out to be the case. So from the Russian side, they pretty much have very few expectations that anything positive is going to come out of the United States. And after the recent constitutional reform referendum, President Putin will have the opportunity to run for 2 more terms. So he's going to be in office until perhaps at least 2036. So their view is maybe within the next 16 years, something can happen, but we're not going to hold our breath for it. And from the U.S. perspective, once President Trump is gone, there's going to be nothing that prohibits or limits the next U.S. president from really taking out a lot of sort of pent-up anger on Russia.
Right. Yuval, how much of a foreign policy priority is Russia for the United States?
Well, disappointingly for Russia, not very. Russia views itself as one of the three big centers or three big countries of international politics. And what they've seen, even with President Trump being really as friendly as possible to Russia, that it still is a U.S.-China world with everyone else playing second fiddle. For the United States, as the previous guest suggested, one of the issues that, in terms of Russia being a domestic politics issue, is that none of the issues of the past even 4 to 6 years, from the Crimean annexation forward, none of those things have been resolved. So because they haven't been resolved, and because there's been so many controversies here and there in terms of Trump's conduct, as well as just the normal interstate relations, it has become an issue in which we're all waiting for basically the page to turn. And the more it doesn't get resolved and the more we don't understand, the more it becomes less of a foreign policy issue, as you suggested, which is what it should be, and more of an issue of let's resolve all the previous storylines of the past couple of years so that we can move on. And that's really where it becomes much more dangerous to the relations between the two states.
Tony Shaffer, there appear to be deep divisions in Washington, broadly along party political lines on seeking better relations with Russia. It's certainly one of President Trump's goals to have better relations with Moscow, but he's also taken action against the Russians, including sanctions, and in the past few days we've seen these reports which I've talked about. These reports have been debunked in some instances, that Russia paid bounties to Taliban fighters to kill soldiers. I just want to play you a little excerpt on how the Russian Foreign Ministry responded to those accusations. Let's listen to this.
People have already expressed their opinions on this topic, not only in Russia, but in the United States itself, including the U.S. president. The head of the Pentagon said there was no evidence confirming such, as they said, false insinuations.
So, Tony, well, besides the fact that, the U.S. can't seem to get its story straight on this, why bring this up now? What impact is it having?
Well, it's been brought up via leaked information. I've been told what the administration thinks the source is. That should be interesting unto itself. But it's contradictory information. It's intelligence. Apparently, the information was collected incidentally to a special forces raid in Afghanistan. I've been on those interrogations. As you know, I worked this sort of operation in Afghanistan. That information contradicts NSA's information on the same subject. And I think the controversy is about the fact that we have two different intelligence sources contradicting. At this point, I don't think we can take any decisive action against the Russians on this issue. So with that said, you brought up the fact that the president has done other things. He's walked away from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Forces, Nuclear Forces Treaty. He's strengthened NATO. At the same time, he's offered an olive branch by offering the Russians a seat back at the G7 to make it the G8. So I think the best way of describing the Trump policy is very Reagan-esque. I work with a lot of my friends and mentors are Reagan cabinet members. And the idea here is to actually practically move forward with the Russians. There are areas we can agree upon, that we should agree upon. There's other areas where they have been up to no good. Look, I signed 2 different letters today regarding the state of Georgia and Florida, where I'm working with those governments to try to secure their elections, their electronic election machines against hacking, which we think the Russians may try to do. They can be a punching bag. At the same time, they can actually be up to no good. The two are not mutually exclusive.
Right. Tony, what do you make of reports that we see pretty often here in the United States that there are elements within the foreign policy establishment right here who are not in favor of better relations?
I think that's self-evident, and that refers to where we think the leak may have come from to the New York Times of this one report that was clearly classified because it was incidental to a special forces raid where they picked up a cache. I think that's illegal. Again, I've been on both sides of this. I've been a collector. I've been a person that handles the policy. I've been a person having to brief at the White House. And you have to be very careful about how you use raw information. In this case, it was politicized to create a political effect to further damage the relationship with the United States and Russia. And that is not productive, and I think everybody now is suffering the consequences from that.
All right, let me bring in Victor Olevich. Victor, what's the view from Moscow? How does the Kremlin see these actions that have been taken by Washington, by the Trump administration against Russia? And what does it make of these latest accusations? Is there a desire in Russia for better relations?
Well, the assessment for Russian-American relations, at least for the near future, is quite bleak. A significant part of the American foreign policy establishment believes that the same or similar complex of measures that brought down the USSR may be effective this time against Russia, and it does not believe in effective dialogue with Moscow on a number of strategic stability issues. At the same time, the Russian government believes that it has a limited choice of policy, and that waiting it out seems to be one of these choices, and the most effective one at this point. So as far as the leak to the New York Times by Central Intelligence Agency officials, it seems that it is not intended to create further problems in relations between Washington and Moscow, but it was also strategically placed in a very politically sensitive time in the United States, just several months before the upcoming November presidential elections. And it seems to have been placed at a time when it would be most damaging to the Trump administration. It is no secret that the Trump administration and a part of the American intelligence community have been at odds for years on a number of issues, and this looks like a possible reprisal and attempt to create problems during the American presidential election campaign. And the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Russian government views it as a step that is not friendly to Russia, this unverified leak. And it also views it as part of the American domestic political struggle.
Yuval, what's your view on that? Do you think the timing of these leaks and what we've seen over the past few weeks is done in a way that would influence the outcome of the election?
Perhaps. I mean, the leaks themselves certainly were coming at the time that President Trump had been talking about bringing Russia back into, I guess, the G8 from the G7, which had been kicked out, I think, in the aftermath of the conflict in Ukraine. And so we could see that's probably tied maybe directly to that, and then just more generally speaking to President Trump's time in office. And so we have to even see, in terms of even the foundational policy documents of the United States, the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, they specifically name Russia as a rival in great power competition. And similarly, Russia's foreign policy concept, which is sort of analogous, also calls out the United States, not exactly by name, but it's quite clear who they're talking about, as being the chief rival to Russia as well. So the rivalry between these two countries is hardwired in. And, you know, to the extent that Russia is taking a more active role in international affairs, is, you know, taking a more aggressive role abroad, which, you know, that's up to them to do, the consequence is they're taking something from someone, and that's America's international influence. So part of this reaction is probably natural and what the Russians should expect if they want to play a more active role, and the United States has been this status quo power. There's going to be conflict along those lines. As for this specific program, what's been interesting about this specific thing is that Russia, and we've seen a number of examples, they've really gone after two sorts of person to try to assassinate abroad. One general group is like people like Sergei Skripal, which are people who worked for Russia's intelligence services and then defected to the other side, or were moles. Or there was a Bulgarian arms dealer who's supplying Ukraine. So people are taking an active role against Russia's foreign policy interests. There's also been a lot of people who have been assassinated related to Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya.
Yeah.
It would be basically a bold new step to then go against U.S. soldiers in the field. It's not impossible, but it wouldn't track with the last several years of what has happened.
Okay, Anton, when you hear things like that, when you hear that the United States believes that Russia is a rival, how does Russia respond to things like that?
Well, you know, strangely enough, it's a flattering thing to hear because in no way, militarily, economically, demographically, or geopolitically, is Russia, or can Russia be an actual rival to the United States, or to China for that matter. It's not interested in being that. So accusations that are made in Washington are both flattering. Unfortunately, of course, they come with consequences such as sanctions and attempts to isolate. That hasn't worked, and we've seen that over and over again. Russia continues to enjoy positive relations with a whole range of neighbors in Eurasia. So that's one side of it. The other side of it, of course, is that when we really get to the campaign of the presidential campaign, I mean, when you know, you start listing things that actually matter to the overwhelming majority of Americans, be it COVID, be it its economic impact, be it race relations, be it the endless wars in the Middle East, on all of the most important issues that an average American who doesn't read foreign affairs, for example, on a regular basis, cares about, Russia doesn't rank in the top 10, I would imagine. So it really is unfortunate that two countries that can really cooperate and get a lot of things done, both in terms of terrorism and geopolitics, not to mention space and science and a whole bunch of other issues, are constantly at loggerheads on things that are actually marginal to both of their populations.
Tony, as we hear from Anton, there is potential for these two countries to cooperate and resolve some of the more intractable problems in the world. But if we look at one of the most common accusations against Russia, that it interfered in the 2016 election, I mean, we could look at this in one of two ways. Either Russia interfered and influenced the outcome of the election, or the Democrats are using this as a scapegoat to explain why they lost the election to Donald Trump. But ultimately, whatever it is, it does have an impact on the relationship, doesn't it?
It does. Look, I'm a pragmatist. I'd like to look at this as an opportunity for both sides to actually do positive things. The Russians are either bullies or competitors. I don't know which it is, because they continue to do aggressive things like fly over our ships at 40 feet, violate airspace. So it's kind of like, yeah, it may not be a competitor, but they're doing aggressive things. And the election thing is exactly that example. The Russians have never given up their ability to do internet operations. And plus, they're masters at deception. During the Cold War, they had a lot of deception programs. Vladimir Putin is a KGB officer. A leopard does not change his spots. And I think that they are very much into asymmetric warfare when it meets their goals. With that said, there are a lot of things like Syria, anti-Islamic radicalization and radicalism, working cooperatively to examine how to benefit multiple countries economically. These are all things we should be focused on. These are the sort of things I would love to spend my time focused on. Unfortunately, we have observed real threats from the Russians which have to be addressed. And like the whole thing with Afghanistan, I don't believe the Russians were paying a bounty. With that said, we did kill Russians during the occupation of Afghanistan, and that memory sits within the memory of a lot of folks. So I see it within a reasonable potential, and it's that reasonable potential that Democrats and others use to facilitate this becoming a wedge. Smarter minds, those who understand the history and can see past the history, to focus on achievable joint objectives should be the way we move forward, and I'd like to believe that's the way we will go as the two nations.
Victor Olevich, something that we often hear here in the United States is that President Trump is very soft on Russia, that President Putin couldn't have a better friend in the White House than President Trump. But if we look at some of the actions that President Trump has taken against Russia, for instance, and we often hear about the United States relationship with NATO, but NATO has moved its forward positions, it's fortified them. Even Poland has been offered a permanent base, and as Tony pointed out earlier on, the United States has pulled out of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, as well as the Open Skies Treaty. So when you look at it like that, I mean, has President Trump really been good for Russia?
Well, if we look at U.S. foreign policy towards Russia during the Trump years, we can see that, in fact, it has hardened in comparison to the policy pursued by Barack Obama's administration. It was Trump who ordered the closing of the Russian consulate in San Francisco. He also ordered the closing of a Russian trade annex in Washington, a number of other facilities. A number of Russian diplomats were expelled following the so-called Skripal affair, and also more and more vigorous and tougher sanctions were introduced by the United States. These acts passed by Congress were signed by Trump. So we have seen at times a softer rhetoric by Trump towards Russia in comparison to that of his predecessor. But at the same time, the actions that the Trump White House, the Trump administration has taken toward Moscow are at times even tougher than the ones that taken by his predecessor. He seems to follow the old American adage, speak softly and carry a big stick, loved so much by Teddy Roosevelt, whom he admires. I would also point out to my colleague who talked about Russia taking asymmetric steps and engaging in asymmetric warfare against what it views as its Western adversaries. Of course, Russia is taking asymmetric steps for the exact reason that it is a much weaker power than the United States. It does not have the same power projection opportunities as the United States. It has limited diplomatic opportunities in a number of regions in the world, a more limited military force projection, and therefore Moscow has seen that asymmetric steps are about the only possible or only effective measures it can take in this situation. Weaker states are in a way forced to look at a more limited number of options in their foreign policy actions than stronger states like the United States.
Yuval Weber, if we look at the current posture of these two countries, the United States and Russia, it's one of hostility right now. And you know, as we've just heard, there's this asymmetric war that's going on between them, this low-key war that's taking place right now. What would it take for that to change? Do you think much would change if, hypothetically, Joe Biden becomes president after November?
I think it would go into an even more dangerous phase, because what Russia and, to this extent, China have, what they've really benefited from President Trump has been a president, a U.S. president, who really wants to take a much more unilateral approach to the allies and to take a hands-off affair to many different types of issue areas and crises. So the ability to expand Russian and Chinese influence has actually been pretty good from their perspective. And so what I would imagine President Putin would see, let's say, candidate Biden becomes President Biden, is that there's going to be a much more hostile reaction from the United States going forward. And at that point, the ability to expand into sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, Middle East, and across Russia's borders as well, is going to be challenged much more consistently. So we might actually see greater instances of force-on-force conflict that we have not from President Obama and President Trump.
Right.
And so that's something that could change going forward.
Anton, what are your thoughts on that? You know, late last year in December, there was a conference held by the Brookings Institution, which is based here in Washington, D.C., and that conference posed this question. It said, are the United States and Russia destined to be geopolitical foes?
They are not destined to be geopolitical foes, but they are destined to be geopolitical competitors. But then again, if you're a realist, that should come as no surprise. Countries compete with each other on a regular basis. We know that the United States competes with both its countries it considers its opponents, but also countries that it considers its allies. There's a reason why Angela Merkel's phone was hacked and listened into. And listen, adults in a world that is not a particularly pleasant place, but doesn't have to be on edge and at knife point all the time, simply get over things like this. So look, are they going to be competitors in the sense that in a world of realism that operates by the rules of realism, countries compete? Then definitely. But are they destined to be enemies and existential opponents? Absolutely not. But of course it serves a lot of people's interests on both sides of the ocean to make them just that. The military-industrial complex is one. There are politicians who try to make careers out of this. Those are the other. And unfortunately, there are times when public opinion is carried along in that direction. Look, Russia and the United States have gone through many cycles of détente and then a sharpening of the relationship. That's been the history of pretty much most of the 20th century, since 1917 at least. And so I guess that the smartest and furthest looking minds need to start preparing now for the foundation of an inevitable dialogue beginning.
Tony, I've just got a minute left, but where do you see the best chances, the best potential for an improvement in relations?
We've been competitors since the Cold War. I chased Russian-funded terrorists in 1985. I was approached by the Russians. Anna Chapman, the FBI, briefed me on me being targeted. Russians will be Russians. The United States will be United States. Our joint best future is to set aside the past and work to find areas of cooperation. We all know we can mess with each other. It's time to stop messing with each other, try to figure out how we can build an effective, mutually beneficial relationship that benefits our countries and benefits the world.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us.
Thank you.
And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.